You know that this country has done the right thing when the Labor Party, the Greens, the Canberra Press Gallery and now the United Nations are having a giant cry because, of course, the government got control of its borders back. The Medevac legislation, which was relentlessly abused by advocates for supposedly life and death situations, just 13 of the 184 ended up going to hospital. None of them stayed. People were in for constipation, and as we've said every night, the bloke who put palm oil into his penis, oh no, it was all the serious cases. Anyway, this is what the UNHCR has had to say. These are the people whose human rights are being policed by, among others, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, you know, all the normal ones. After more than 6 years of uncertainty regarding solutions, UNHCR is extremely concerned about the health situation of asylum seekers and refugees will continue to deteriorate. Well, that would be true if there weren't doctors on Nauru, but there are, Bronwyn. As Australia retains responsibility for people forcibly transferred under its offshore arrangements, you mean people who arrived here illegally, refuse to go home, refuse to go to places like the United States, but aren't able to just freely wander amongst the community of which they tried to illegally enter? Well, Bronwyn, as I say, if it's the Press Gallery, Labor, the Greens and the UN who've got a frown on their face, it means the right thing happened.
I've got to tell you that people in other parts of the world view our border protection laws with great envy, and they think we wish that their governments would do something about protecting them similarly. Because I mean, the offshore protection program was initiated because if people arrive on Australian soil, then they can get access to the courts, and it can drag on for years. It eats up all the legal aid money. It becomes a magnet for people to come and to try even more, and that's why this system was put in place in the first place. Now, this legislation was a real chink in the wall, and it was allowing our borders to be weakened, and that's why the government worked so hard to ensure it was repealed. And I think that's certainly the work that was done in talking with Jackie Lambie. It was not a deal, as people like to try and say that there was some quid pro quo. I think Jackie Lambie came to understand what the difficulties are, and if it is possible to have people go to New Zealand, where there is a no visa provision for any of the people who go there, and it's up to Australia to say who comes here and who gets a visa and doesn't, then that's a perfectly logical thing for a government to pursue. So this was a vastly important decision and outcome, and of course they're going to scream because they voted for it in the first place. Correct.
Nicholas, it was interesting to see that in the previous program, the former Senator Derryn Hinch said he regretted his choice on Medevac, in that it was a miscalculation on his behalf, and he probably got that vote wrong. That, of course, would have meant that this never would have become a situation in the first place.
Look, I think the overturning of the Medevac legislation is a terrible thing, Paul. I mean, here we are in the lead up to Christmas, a Christian festival where, you know, we should reflect on what Christian values mean. You know, when you boil it all down, it's as Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you, and I don't think there's any love in what Australia's done here. I just think it's an act of cruelty, and, you know, I think it's sad that you boast that it must be good if the United Nations is decrying what's happened. I think the United Nations is calling it as it is. You know, this was an effective and often life-saving measure, and the Australian Parliament has gone and repealed it. I think it's an absolutely terrible day.
If it's life-saving, why did only 13 of the 184 have to go to hospital?
Well, I mean, you can pick out some examples of
13
where things
of
that I think, you know, like the guy with the penis and the
13.
palm oil. Like, you
what about the constipation guy?
There is no system that is perfect, but as the UN said, it was overall, it was effective and often life-saving. I mean, look, we can only hope that now the Morrison government will sort of accept our common humanity and embrace the offer by New Zealand to take 150 people a year, and then together with what the United States is doing, we can get those 460 people off PNG and Nauru.
Nicholas.
You know, they've been there for 6 years, living in limbo, a living hell, and hopefully they can be allowed to have a life.
James, the problem is I think that this turned... I just think it was sold as life and death, that would mean more than 13 people go to hospital. If nothing else, those that are the great advocates of this law, they should have sent these people to hospital first, because then we could have said, well, you know, they were able to get something and they stayed for a week. Instead, it wasn't about that at all.
Yeah, but that's absolutely right. I mean, we should remember that this was not about, you know, life and death for these people. It was about finding a way of bringing them here.
Correct.
It's not as I keep saying every time I come on TV and I talk about it. What's happened was not a bug, it was a feature. It was designed to do that. The people who wrote the legislation knew perfectly well what was happening. They knew perfectly well what the outcome was going to be. The question is not whether it's cruel, and you know, the question is whether it's necessary to prevent a recurrence of what we saw, sorry to bring it up, Nicholas, under Labor. Let's not forget that every single one of the people that we're talking about here was sent to PNG and Nauru under the Labor government because they lost control of the borders. And it was a truism then, and it's still a truism today, that the moment that we show any sort of weakness on this front, the boats will come back. And the other thing, no, let me finish. The other thing is, Labor, I don't think, a lot of people in Canberra, in the Labor Party, are not actually sorry this has gone, because they know in their heart of hearts that this was a terrible mistake for them politically. There's a lot of evidence that when the moment this passed, that was when the polls started to turn for the Labor Party in Queensland.
Correct. Well, and if you want to stick with KK, mate, you know, waving around opinion polls as justification for legislation, good luck.
Well, look, James Campbell can go on waging the history wars all night if he wants to. What I'm trying to focus on tonight is what we can do going forward. And the fact is there's been some very important policy changes in recent years, like the boat turnbacks, which has meant that those boats just aren't getting through to Australia anymore. Okay, the Australian Navy, guess what, is better than those rickety old sea boats, and they can't get back. So and Tony Abbott instituted this policy, I'll be the first to acknowledge that, it has meant that Australia's security arrangements have changed and the boats can no longer get here. So this idea that we need to keep allowing this awful injustice to continue, the cruelty to continue, as a deterrent to others.
Why is it cruel? Why is it cruel?
It's sick, right?
What's sick, Nicholas, is you trying to invoke Christmas into your argument. I can wear you speaking your wokish lot and getting up on your lefty hind legs, but not to start invoking the Christmas spirit and trying to say that this is justification for what you believe in, because it's not. Now, the bottom line is, by stopping the boats coming, by stopping the people smuggling business, we have stopped people drowning at sea. And this chink in the wall was opening it up again. Now, you've got to think about the wear and tear on the Navy and the people in Border Patrol who actually have to deal with the people who are coming through. And they have to get them out of those leaky boats and into the boats we provide to send them back from whence they've come. It is an enormous task for them. And a lot of those people who've had to deal with dragging bodies out of the sea when the Labor Party let the borders go have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder themselves. So don't give me this rubbish about what's cruel and what's kind and what's not. The bottom line is we have a regular immigration program, we have a compassionate refugee program, but we won't have people who come here who want to be breaking our rules and want to jump the queue and simply want to say, we want to go there and we're not going to seek refuge in any other country, we just want Australia. And it's just not on, and we've got a strong policy which Labor, if it ever got in, would dismantle once again.
Well, you're entitled to your opinions, Bronwyn, but let me give you a few facts. This idea that the moment we show one scintilla...
Don't give me that rubbish.
This argument that you're running, that if you show these people one scintilla of human kindness, then suddenly you'll open the floodgates
of people coming to Australia. One scintilla of human kindness is giving them doctors on Nauru. They have facilities.
Because now there are people going from these places to the United States. Has that caused the floodgates to open?
20 of the people who are...
Why has that not occurred? Because they can't get through. They can't get through.
20 of the people who came to Australia under this farcical law were approved for the United States. and didn't go
the
because they wanted
cruelty
here,
does not
because
need
the
to
welfare
continue.
system's better.
Why is it cruel? Why is it cruel? Tell me why it's cruel.
Because these people's lives are in limbo. They have no
By their own
certainty
actions.
about what's going on. Well, okay, so do you think the punishment fits the crime? Do you?
Is it a punishment? Is it a punishment to live in Papua New Guinea?
All they did was
Is it a punishment to live on Nauru? Why is that a punishment?
All these people did was try to come to Australia, as many millions of people have tried to do in the past, but the mistake they made was to try and come here by boat. And for that,
they paid people
they've been
smugglers.
stuck on PNG and Nauru for 6 years. The punishment does not fit the
While
crime.
being offered the chance to go to places like the United States. Well, I mean,
Why is it a punishment at all?
I would take. Would you take Nauru over a camp in Syria? Syria, in the Middle East, where tens of millions of people, of course, are gathered? Bloody oath you would. The whole point of the way the refugee system works is that you go to your nearest safe country, right? The thing is, whether we like it or not, the truth is Australia is an island, which means we know what those next countries are. The nearest safe country is very inevitably never Australia, which is why we have a front door system that takes a football stadium of refugees every single year. That's our compassion. That's our scintilla of hope. That's our arrangement with the rest of the world. People trying to circumvent that are not going to the next safest port of call. They were shopping for the most comfortable place to go.
I agree with you that we are a very generous nation when it comes to the number of people we allow to come here each year, Paul Murray. But I do not think that leaving these people in PNG and Nauru serves any deterrent or purpose anymore. It is just furthering unnecessary harm to these other humans.
I just want to show, because I think I may have mentioned. If I did, I apologise. This is what the former Senator Hinch had to say at the end of his program tonight.
Looking back now, playing Monday morning quarterback, it's easy to do so, I suppose. I think what I probably should have done, when it came down to my vote, that one person shouldn't hold a government to ransom, and what I probably should have done was said to the voters and said to the electorate, look, if you really hate what the government's doing here, if you really support this Medevac idea, then let them block it now and whatever, and then throw them out when we have an election 5 or 6 months from now. I mean, I know I paid the price for it, and that's the way democracy works.
He said he paid the price for it for voting for it in the first place. So just interesting. One of the people involved in the establishment is now saying that about that it shouldn't have happened. It should have, if you had an issue with it, it should have gone to the general election.